allowing me to present this and to attend marvelous conferences, marvelous lectures that we had the chance to listen to yesterday and today. By focusing on the shifting center-periphery dynamic that characterizes many different expressions of avant-garde theatre, the stimulating call for papers for this conference invites us to reconsider, if not resolve, a curious spatio-temporal crux that lies behind any consideration of such projects in their concrete geographical and sociocultural environments. Just as it is difficult to determine the nature of the historical rupture that decisively shapes the art of the avant-garde, and its theatre in particular, namely to tell what historical and aesthetic circumstances that made individual avant-garde movements and actors gain the attributes of radicalism, novelty and experimentation, it is perhaps even more difficult to identify the ways in which the avant-garde's afterlife, its re-emergence in the second wave in the late 60s and 70s of the 20th century, challenged existing distributions of power within the cultural field. The situation of the rather short-lived Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia is quite unique in this in this chronopolitical respect, as Branimir Jakovljević theorized in his intriguing book Alienation Effects. Since the former Yugoslavia was itself a modern political and political-economic experiment, courageously eschewing the Cold War cultural divisions, and was ruled by a party that famously claimed to be the avant-garde of the working class, it could have by no means been considered, at least not from the late 50s and early 60s on, at a periphery of European modernization processes, intellectual standards, and also, at least in retrospect, bold artistic experiments and ideological subversions, as we heard yesterday, mainly in plastic and performing arts, that could pride themselves to rightfully belong to post-World War II avant-garde movements. However, as Rana Senković's study, Popular Experience of Socialist Culture, shows, despite all the intellectual efforts at maintaining the cultural edginess of Yugoslav public scene that Jakovljević traces, these experiments took a relatively peripheral position vis-à-vis the dominant cultural policy of party leaders, which was to a large extent a curious mixture of inherited bourgeois aesthetic criteria in all the arts and a tolerance of the local appropriation of the Western entertainment industry propagated by the burgeoning media, sometimes criticized by the state ideologues such as Stipe Šuvar, but never too harshly, as mass culture, potentially endangering the authenticity of socialist cultural aspirations. It is therefore unavoidable, in my opinion, when discussing a particular phenomenon, author, or group belonging to the ex-U avant-garde theatre, to repeatedly address eventual paradoxes of periodization and localization on the ever-receding scale between the center and its periphery, especially given the fact that ex-Yugoslavia consisted of several republics whose capitals, especially Ljubljana, Zagreb, Sarajevo, and Belgrade, relentlessly competed for the role of the ruling cultural center. Here I would like to point out how such paradoxes pertain even to a more narrow, if not even regional scale, by focusing on the, I think, curious geocultural and chronopoetic and chronopolitical position of the Dubrovnik student theatre Lero, which tends to slip from contemporary overviews of either the ex-U or Croatian theatre avant-garde, although it represents a rare jewel on the Croatian map of non-institutional theatre, indeed a jewel in the heart of the Croatian periphery, which Dubrovnik definitely is geographically, and at the same time in the heart of the most independent and highly developed civilization Croatia can ever boast of having partaked, which Dubrovnik definitely was historically, from the medieval times to the arrival of Napoleon's troops, which, however, did not prevent the above-mentioned bizarre cultural policy to be embodied in this same city at its fullest during the socialist period, since one of the famous and internationally recognized Yugoslav cultural projects, the Dubrovnik Summer Festival, was founded there in the 1950s to fortify Dubrovnik's growing touristic destiny and profitable prospects. Alongside some of the prominent local stars from all the republics, the festival, as a heavily sponsored state event, at its best hosted many world-renowned musicians and theatre makers, all of whom were invited to participate in this manifestation and create concerts, recitals and environmental performances, mostly based on both European and local classical and modernist repertoire, but mostly classical. From Greeks and Shakespeare via Calderon, Molière and Goethe to most cherished national classics, Marin Držić, Ivan Gundulić and Ivo Vojnović, as well as their more recent reinterpreters from Edward Bond's Lear to LADA Castellan's reinterpretations of Euripides. I could not have missed to mention this particular manifestation because in the more than 50 years of its uninterrupted existence, the Lero Student Theatre, the Lero Student Theatre has lived in a somewhat ambiguous relationship with the festival, half as its antagonist, half as an admiring shadow of this seasonal refreshment of a basically provincial, culturally stifled, small town, all the while serving as the internal reminder that neither the festival nor the only theatre in the town, Kazalište Marina Držića, do necessarily fulfill all the creative needs and energies of Dubrovnik's inhabitants. In 1968, in which it was founded, Lero first started out as a mere satirical outlet for a group of intellectuals and young people who adopted this name, Lero, traditionally given in Dubrovnik to all eccentric, free-spirited, humorous individualists. However, with the arrival of its current leader and director, by profession a journalist, Davor Mojaš, in the early 70s, he was only in his 20s then, Lero profiled its repertoire in a much more thoughtful way and managed not only to establish but also to maintain firm ideological and expressive links with European historical avant-gardes and neo-avant-gardes, putting on stage such playwrights as Jarry, Harms, Mayakovsky, Bredensky, Vitkiewicz, Ružević, Brecht, Ionesco and Beckett, none of whom was ever performed in Dubrovnik until then, besides perhaps one piece by Brecht. Organizing ironic recitals of partisan agitprop poetry, humorous cabaret skits and occasional happenings, as also performing modern Croatian playwrights and poets such as the surrealist Radovan Ivšić, the expressionist Miroslav Krleža, and the rebel woman poet of the 1950s, Vesna Parun, as well as local poets and playwrights such as Milan Milišić and Luko Paljetak. These outstanding first decades of Mojaš's engagement ensured that Lero established itself as a favorite theatre amateur group of theatre critics in ex-Yugoslavia, since the group regularly won prizes at the annual meetings of theatre amateurs at Republican and federal level, and received numerous opportunities for international visits to Solun, Bologna, Krakow, Ljubljana, Pečuh, Vienna, Cambridge, London, Manchester and Glasgow, as also to the Brouhaha in Liverpool, where in 1992 Lero even performed at the opening of the festival. Many of its members who joined the group as youngsters in the 1960s and 70s aspired to become professional actors, a status some of them succeeded in achieving either by accepting engagements in the local theatre or by leaving Dubrovnik to start a more visible acting career in Zagreb, as like the two early deceased darling of Croatian film audiences, Predrag Vušović-Pređo, or like Doris Šarić-Kukuljica, who is still an important asset of the Zagreb Youth Theatre, one of the city's acting ensembles known for its penchant for collective play. Nevertheless, as the last 3 decades of Lero's thriving presence in the city testify, Mojaš gradually emphasized more and more the group's affiliation to a historically confirmed tradition that had once brought Dubrovnik very close to the center of European cultural life, of the Renaissance and Baroque academies that flourished mainly in Italy, but inspired an analogous fashion in the neighboring Croatian, that is, Dalmatian small towns. These were also associations of ambitious theatre amateurs, most of them noblemen, who considered themselves to be at the center of theatrical culture at a time when, as you all know, throughout Europe, acting as profession was still despised as being more suited to the margins of society, i.e. to lower classes who had to earn their living by selling their bodies for money. However, the irony that marks Lero's later explicit commitment to this legacy described and exalted in Mojaš's surrealist novel Kazalište Isprazni, the Vanity Theatre, a kind of fictionalized memoir of the troupe in which the troupe is represented as performing in an epoch without precise temporal coordinates. So the irony is the growing female dominance in the troupe, as women were not allowed to become members of the Renaissance academies and were in fact the main target of the attacks on despised professionals. For Mojaš, however, female performers became an important artistic medium for a critical revision of the historical context favoring such deprecatory attitudes, as I will explain in a moment. Just in the brackets, when we speak about this context of professionalism and amateurism, which is itself an ironic example of the historically conditioned relationships between what is considered central to a given culture and what is considered peripheral, it is perhaps interesting to mention in passing a revealing episode involving scandalized professionals in which Lero was also involved. In the late 1970s, the Dubrovnik Festival opened its hitherto closely guarded high cultural doors for a section of the program called Days of the Youth Theatre, until then organized in the Croatian capital Zagreb. The festival hosted big names from the world of avant-garde theatre, from bread and puppet theatre to La Fura dels Baus, and important Croatian avant-garde theatre groups also performed there, like Kokole Moko and Kugla Glumište. In 1979, one of them, Kugla Glumište, also a group of amateurs, organized one of the most impressive environmental happenings ever seen in Dubrovnik, ljetno popodne, summer afternoon, and invited the members of Lero to join them. The performance won the annual prize for the best actor, Orlando, which was awarded to Dunja Koprolčec, because she was just the head of the troupe, one of the members of Kugla Glumište, in fact. And a scandal broke out. One of the main arguments was that it is inconceivable that a non-professional actress, who also appears naked at the end of the performance, should win such an honorable award. I refer to this event only to illustrate the kind of mentality that prevailed at the time, both in Dubrovnik itself and in Croatia, if not also in Yugoslavia. The distinction between professionals and amateurs, not to mention what a man or a woman was entitled to do on stage, was one of the components that strongly influenced the placement of avant-garde performing groups on the map of relevant cultural production. At the end of the 1980s and the early 1990s, and above all, after the outbreak of war, which made Dubrovnik one of the valuable treasures of Croatian identity, the target of heavy bombardment, meant that Lero and its leader Mojaš suddenly took a completely different direction, away from what Vlado Krušić used to describe in his study, The Case of Lero, as, I quote, a healthy, unbridled, mocking attitude, end of quote, towards the ideological hypocrisy that the group unabashedly attacked in its performances until the war. As I said, Mojaš now relied mainly on female performers to invent a theatrical atmosphere all his own, much darker and more enigmatic than the humorous diversions for which the group had previously been known. Although the director himself had suffered several personal blows of fate in the intervening years, which no doubt influenced him to adopt a bleak view of the course of human history, together with his all-female cast, he created a poetics of female melancholy and literary nostalgia that challenged the official historical narrative from the perspective of the often anonymous victims and bystanders, mostly women and children. The new repertoire performed by the troupe consisted mainly of a kind of neo-romantic, decadent collage of paragraphs and lines from poems, plays, diaries and letters by well-known authors from ancient Dubrovnik, philosophers, historians, writers and playwrights, whose works were often addressed either openly or secretly to their sisters, wives and lovers, the ones, however, who as a group remained invisible on the margins of history. These women now came to the forefront of the stage as long-forgotten Beckettian ghosts to tell their history from below. The textual collages served to evoke the oniric atmosphere that the director had devised in a curious continuation of his former avant-garde poetics. He insistently used cryptic, free-floating stage symbols, often props from the women's everyday lives, such as linen, lace, curtains, dresses, hats, gloves and fans, which seem to have been robbed of their rightful former owners and yet resisted the cruel passage of time. Since they were deprived of a clearly articulated narrative context and forced to figure as lost souls, gathering debris of a somewhat distant and mourned civilization, the actresses still adhered to the group's inherited performance style, i.e. depersonalized, frontal address to the public, and ostentatiously non-illusionistic acting. But they became much more aware of the director's ideas than was the case before his turn towards nostalgic local reminiscences, and much more skillful in their diction, also given the fact that, unlike before when they were forced to maintain a neutral Croatian language norm, they now performed in their own language, i.e. in the Dubrovnik dialect, in which they all excelled and took their vocal expression to previously unknown heights. A word should finally be said about Davor Mojaš as a novelist, author of short stories, and above all, more photos. A word, should finally be said about Davor Mojaš as a novelist, author of short stories, and above all as a playwright whose opus manifests the same chronopoetic and chronopolitic ambiguity. When reading his 99 plays published recently in the collections Skroviti Theatre, The Secret Theatre, one immediately notices his adherence to the late 19th and early 20th century avant-garde generic penchant for microdramatic writing. And for all interested in this phenomenon, I refer here to the book Microdramas, Crucibles for Theatre and Time by John H. Muse, although I read in one of Professor Blaž Lukan's recent articles that there is also a German notion of mini-dramas, whose reference compendium was edited by Karl-Heinz Braun. Mojaš's collection shows to be, in this collection, Mojaš shows to be an equally adamant admirer of the Dubrovnik rich historical literary heritage, often consisting of long verbose works that he ironically fragments and then uses selected passages from them that he drastically strips of their context, sometimes also reducing entire works to their wittily exposed backbones. On one hand, therefore, the form of microdrama, as Professor Lukan would put it, liberates the author's anarchist pleasure in writing itself, but on the other hand, the works by his predecessors that Mojaš chooses to borrow, quote, maltreat, paraphrase, mock, and also lovingly reincarnate, do not function here as mere textuality, since the majority of them used to be performed in their full grandeur on the urban stages of Dubrovnik Summer Festival, so that their fragmentation, in fact, attempts to reinstall their legendary, anthological, momentary, performative effects, imprinted in memories of long-standing adepts of the mythic side of the festival's attendance. Since being a radio journalist, Mojaš plundered the archives of audio recordings of these performances and often used the fragments of these performances in his colleges. To conclude, no wonder then that Lero, which for the last 30 years had a number of Mojaš's plays on its repertoire, became and still is one of the regular off-program participants of the festival. Lero thus continues its ambivalent institutional position, since it functions both as the festival's late, neo, post, avant-garde intruder and opponent, reminding the public of the festival's resistant cultural political conservatism, if not anachronicity, and as its supreme alibi, only reconfirming the long-standing programmatic rootedness of the festival's cultural policy, mainly in the local and European classical tradition. Should we consider this to be Lero's or avant-garde's or periphery's victory over the center, or a defeat, an example of assimilation by the field and co-optation, is a question that remains open to debate. Thank you very much for your attention.